Welcome back. It's Intro to Physical Anthropology. I'm your instructor, David Leitner. Today, we're getting down to the meat and potatoes finally. How evolution works. There are a number of things that make evolution work. We call these the forces of evolution. And before we get started, though, I think we need a good definition of what a force of evolution would be. And your authors for the textbook give you the definition. The forces of evolution are those factors in natural populations that cause changes in gene frequencies over multiple generations. That's what evolution is. Evolution is a change in the frequency of genes in a population. When frequencies of genes change, evolution has occurred, and it may occur for a number of reasons. Now, the factors that are causing those changes, the kinds of changes that they are, could either be adaptive, in which case a particular gene's frequency will increase, or they could be non-adaptive, in which case they'll either remain the same or go down. Now, it's important to understand that natural selection, which is one of the forces of evolution, is not the same as evolution. Okay? Natural selection leads to evolution, or can lead to evolution, but is not evolution itself. It is one of the most commonly cited causes of evolution, but it's by no means the only one. And it may be one of the most important forces shaping evolution. However, the others are actually quite important too. Whichever cause we're talking about, though, one thing remains true. We need variation in the population in order for it to work. Okay? Now, where does that variation come from? Well, we've already learned that mutations are the only way brand new information comes in, and it's the only source of new genes. However, during recombination, combinations of genes and gene alleles can change, which may or may not lead to new traits or different combinations of traits that themselves have adaptive value. The majority of mutations have no effect on you whatsoever. So it's not just the fact that there are mutations, it's that mutations are constantly coming up. And the accumulation of mutations, either slowly over time or in the correct places in the genome, sensitive places like regulatory genes, that can lead to new traits that arise and may be adaptive, in which case evolution can work on them. Now, the relationship between natural selection and evolution is actually a pretty succinct one. Natural selection is a phenomenon at the individual level. Okay, the individual is selected for or against. Okay, you are either taken out of the gene pool or given extra time, I guess. I don't know. But you have a better chance of reproducing. So that's how natural selection is going to work. So it starts in your genotype. And of course, your genotype not only interfaces with the environment to produce the trait, but that trait itself has to it is in the context of an environment that it will either be adaptive or not adaptive. Okay, so the genotype and environment create the phenotype, and the phenotype is what natural selection is working on. Okay, it is selecting for or against that phenotype. Evolution occurs when natural selection has changed the frequencies of these genes in the population as a whole. So, although individuals are the ones that natural selection is working on, it's through working on multiple individuals in the population that evolution occurs, because that's how the gene frequencies change. To see this a little better, I've got this nifty little demonstration. Take a minute to pause the video and count the numbers of each of the dots, each color of dots on here. There's red, blue, green, and yellow. If for some reason you can't see those colors, don't worry, I'm going to go through it as we go along as well. So just sort of pay attention to what I'm saying. Natural selection is changes in gene frequencies. Different alleles of a gene will be distributed unevenly in a population. Okay, so as you can see here, there are only 3 yellow and 3 red dots, right? But there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 blue and 8 green as well. So the green and the blue far outnumber the red and the yellow. However, selective pressures can change the distribution of these alleles. And over time, those frequencies are going to change. So we've got some kind of selective pressure. Maybe it's a change that allows a particular one of these alleles to get food more easily. Maybe it's or maybe it's a predator that is more attractive to some of the alleles than others. So, as we go through this selective pressure, it's had a heavy toll on the blue and the green. We now only have 1 blue, no green, 2 yellow, and 3 red. So the frequencies have changed significantly, right? Compare that to the numbers we had before. 8 blue, 8 green, 3 red, 3 yellow. So red was untouched, yellow was barely touched, but the other two were drastically impacted. Now, as generations go on, assuming those pressures are still in place, yes, the population is going to recover here, but you'll notice it looks very different. The gene frequencies are very, very different now than they were before. We now, after several generations, only have 4 blue. Red has outstripped everybody with 4, 8, 12 individuals now, and yellow has sort of come back to with 8. So, that is how natural selection works, and it's to change frequencies in alleles, and it's that changing frequency that is evolution. Now, evolution can work in a number of different, natural selection can work in a number of different directions. It can change the distributions in a number of different directions. The first is this column on the far left, which is stabilizing selection. That is when the forces of evolution are selecting at the edges of the distribution. Okay, so you can see here at the at the margins of the distribution here, at the tails, selection is going on. And the more selection going on there, the steeper this curve gets, right? In other words, when selection is going on at both ends of the distribution, you're going to reinforce the mean in that distribution, right? Or the median. I'm not sure which is more appropriate, actually. The good example of this is childbirth in humans, particularly childbirth weight. There are natural bounds on the limits of birth weight for human beings, caused by both the female anatomy and the requirements to be able to sort of breathe by yourself, exist without an umbilical cord, right? So, on the one hand, if a baby is too large, it can be a very difficult birth, and it can lead to the mother's death, and possibly the baby's as well. So, that will have an effect on that certainly the mother's ability to have subsequent babies, and therefore her reproductive fitness has gone down, especially if she has died. On the other extreme, if babies are too small, then they haven't developed enough to survive outside of the womb. So there's selective pressures going on, and you notice that they're different selective pressures, right? They're not the same one, but they're both operating on the different extremes of birth weight to have a relatively narrow range of birth weight that humans are born with. Now, directional selection. Directional selection is when the selective pressure is coming from one direction in the distribution. And what that will do is, over time, it will shift the mean over. Okay? So you will see the distribution as a whole begin to move. It won't necessarily change its shape, but it will move in the direction of away from the selective pressure. The final one is called disruptive selection. This is when selection is occurring in the sort of middle values of the population. So here, the selective pressure is actually selecting for the most abundant frequency, the most frequent alleles in the population. And as it does so, the number of those individuals with those alleles falls and keeps falling until you start getting two new peaks here, what we call a bimodal distribution. Okay, this is very important because essentially what's happening is the population is being separated into two different populations. So those are the three main ways that selection changes gene frequencies. Now, selection isn't the only way. Natural selection isn't the only way that that evolution happens. There are two other very important cases of changes in gene distribution that have nothing to do with selective pressures whatsoever. Okay. The first is gene flow, and I kind of want to illustrate these for you using a whiteboard. Hopefully this will work. And here you see we've got two populations, right? Let me get my pens out here. I'll get all our caps up. We got two populations. Sorry, I did a little test earlier. And in between them runs this river that keeps them separated, right? So they are two completely separate populations. Actually, I want to add another color to this one. I don't know if pink is... No, pink's not different enough. Brown. Okay. So, on this side, we've got red, green, blue, purple, and brown dots. And over here, we just have red, green, blue, purple. Okay. Now, so that makes the distributions a little bit different in each one. Now, say a drought comes and the river dries up. And now the two populations can travel between each place. Well, that means you're going to have some brown ones coming this way and entering this population. All right? In addition to all the others being able to move as well. It's going to make the two populations look more similar, right? The distributions of their genes will kind of merge together a little bit. But then the rainy season comes again. And our poor little dots are trapped on their own again. Meaning they will continue evolving, and maybe even one side gains new mutations, right? And they get more different. So, gene flow is as impactful when it is occurring as when it ceases to occur. Gene flow is just that. It's the movement of genes from one population to another. And while it's occurring, the two populations become more similar. When it's not occurring, they become more different. Very, very clear cut here, right? Which windows? Okay, now we're back here. So gene flow is extremely important force, both in maintaining the distribution of allele frequencies, but also in setting up the conditions where they can become different. Now, the next category actually has a few subcategories in it that are or special cases, you might think of them as. And this is called genetic drift. Now, the deal with genetic drift is that it's more apparent in small populations than in large ones. And I'll show you why, right? If you've got a population of 1,000 individuals, and every generation, because of random chance, there's going to be slight fluctuations in the population size, in the gene frequencies, too, right? Not everybody has the same number of children, not everybody has over their lifetime, and not everybody, and the gene frequencies themselves, especially if it's a recessive trait, may not be distributed, down in every child. So the rate of this trait is in the community is going to fluctuate over time. But if you have enough individuals, those fluctuations kind of even out, and you get that nice straight line there. It approximates a straight line. So you'll always know, even if it goes up, it's going to come down. If it comes down, it's going to come up, as long as the population is large enough. Now, if you have a population of only 10, however, let's say let's say you lose 2 people in the first generation, right? That's 8. And then maybe you pick up one here, so now you're up to 9. And then you're going to lose, let's say 5, right? Or lose 4 of those, you're going to be at 5. Could keep going down. If you have a couple of bad years, lose 3, lose 1. Now you have 1 individual left. It's really, it's a crapshoot whether that person's going to pass on their genes. So it's possible for traits in small populations to disappear. And vice versa. It can also work its way up as well. The random fluctuations are just like that. If you've ever flipped coins a whole bunch of times, you'll get these runs where it's like heads, 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 and it just seems completely unnatural. Or tails, it doesn't matter which. But these runs have a greater effect on the small scale than on the large scale. And so in small populations, genetic drift can be a determining factor in permanently altering genetic frequencies. Okay? So, founder effect is something that occurs in any size population. It's actually probably more likely to occur in larger populations, though, as opposed to genetic drift, which is mostly happening in small populations. And what it looks like is, let's say you've got a population, let's put, what is that, 6 red dots. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, you've got a random population here. It is unevenly distributed, the gene frequencies are, because it's a large enough population. If a trend in one part of the population begins, it may take a while to reach the rest of the population. But what happens is just a piece of this population breaks off and travels to an island. Maybe they get stuck on a log and float to this island just off the coast, and they're no longer having any contact with the mainland population here. This is what they'll look like. All right. You'll notice there's no green in this population. So it's not a perfect representation of the population as a whole. Instead, it's just a piece, whoever happened to be in this corner when they flew off. So this founding population is going to have a big effect on how subsequent generations, oops, there we go, will look. Okay? So now these two populations look very, very different, don't they? So that is the founder effect. It's what happens when a piece of a population is isolated in some way, and the gene frequencies in that piece of the population will become the founding gene pool for the new population. Okay. Now we have genetic bottleneck. Genetic bottleneck occurs when there's a rapid reduction in population that isn't necessarily a selective force. So you can think of sudden tragic things like a volcano exploding or something like that. And I'll just use this same chart here. Maybe I'll add some other colors in as well. Okay, we've got some brown in there too. Okay, so something happens, catastrophic flood or some other catastrophe, and the population is shrunk suddenly and very drastically. Well, who survives the catastrophe is more or less just going to be a matter of luck. So, let's say we got one green guy through, and we got a blue guy, and we got a brown guy, right? They made it through and survived. So the new population after this is going to look like that. See, it's kind of related to founder effect in this way. It's just the mechanism of how this happens is a little different. So the new population is going to just be a subset of the genetic diversity of the old population, as you can see here. No reds survived, no purples survived, and therefore the population will not look like that anymore. Will not look like this anymore. So founder effect is an interesting thing. It's not real common, but it does happen. In fact, it happened in our ancient past, and maybe a key reason for spurring our migration out of Africa, and may have ultimately sort of favored more inventive, more creative thinkers, brains. Brain is thinker. Yeah, so founder effect and genetic bottleneck are very similar. It's just the mechanism of how we go about isolating that gene pool that's different. One is a catastrophe, is some kind of a sudden drop in population size. The other is a founding population that strikes off from the rest. Okay. Again, all of these have a larger effect in small populations because Well, that's just the way the law of large numbers works. The more individuals you have, the better chance someone representing every variation is going to survive the catastrophe, for instance. Okay, now for the last of our mechanisms or forces of evolution. This is sexual selection. And sexual selection it's got a really interesting history. So, in 1860, when Darwin first published, dropped a pen cap, first published On the Origin of Species, he deliberately avoided addressing the question of the origin of human beings in it. That was a political decision. He certainly had opinions on it. But it was probably better. It was going to be controversial enough. He figured it would be better to get the idea out there first and let the real heresy, as people might see it, save that for later. And he did it in a book in which he was called The Descent of Man, which wasn't just about human beings, but also how sexual dimorphism comes to be. That is, why is it in sexual species you have these different characteristics of males and females? How does that come about? And some of his sort of thoughts about how human beings developed were around some of this process of what he called sexual selection. So sexual selection is the differential reproductive success within one sex of any species. So this leads to sexual dimorphism. Dimorphism is a big scary word. It just means means two. Morph means shape. Dimorphism, two shapes. So we have two shapes for the general sort of male and female sexes. Again, I know I am overgeneralizing biological sex here, but those questions don't necessarily come into this process. Now it occurs in two directions, though. There is both a struggle between males for access to mates, and there's a struggle of females to choose the right mate. This is generally the way that sexual selection is framed. More recently, there's been attempts to sort of also throw into it this idea of, these traits may not be confer actual advantages on the individual other than just being aesthetically pleasing. And that's a big debate right now. Is sexual selection completely independent of natural selection, or do the traits selected for have to be in some way advantageous elsewhere? The big cases that seem to sort of point out this paradox, the question isn't just why are men and women different, why are males and females different? It's why especially among males, why is there so much time, energy, and effort put into growing parts of their body that have no point except to somehow be involved not with the actual mating of the mating process, but with attracting mates or fighting for them. Rams have these enormous horns, and the only thing those horns get used for in the males is having contests to headbutt each other to see who's more dominant, so who has first choice of mates. Male grouse do these elaborate songs and dances involving this strange organ they've got on their chest that they flap together, and it makes a slapping sound. These are incredibly elaborate. They take a lot of time. They prepare this large, anywhere from 10 to 30 foot wide mound out on the prairie, and clear it away and are there hoping, and they just do this activity for hours hoping to attract a female. Peacocks, they're a classic one, right? Here is an example of, just like rams, so sometimes rams lock their horns and they can die if they can't get them unlocked. Although some people say that actually might be a myth, and in fact, actually nobody's actually seen one die. So jury's out there. But peacocks have these enormous, completely not aerodynamic, heavy, bright feathers that they sort of flutter about to attract females. And that make them a perfect target for a predator, right? They have no possible way of escaping. So how on earth does that evolve? The natural selection version of this sex selection answer is, well, yes, the females like it, but they like it in part because it shows that he is so fit he's willing to take the risk. Okay. Others say, yeah, I don't know about that. What if, let's take a look at the actuals. Is there a correlation between being healthy and having these feathers, right? Others say you don't actually have to be healthy. It just have to signal that message in some way to the female. So, the jury's still out on exactly why some of these things happen, but we know it happens. We know that there, over generation after generation, females I should actually put it this way. It's not always females that are doing the selecting. It is only the sex that is less reproductively available. In most species, females produce fewer gametes during their lifetime. They have, when they are pregnant, they rarely actually engage in mating at the same time. So they're either watching over their eggs or taking care of them or taking care of young, something like that. So mating is a heavy, heavy investment. They have fewer chances than males do, and so the consequences of choosing wrong are pretty big. On the other hand, males produce millions of gametes in every ejaculate. They have they can mate whenever. Most species, males are fertile for pretty much their whole lives. And so they have a lot more chances to mate. If the females are being picky and the males don't have to be picky, what that leads to is females having a monopoly, sort of, on a product that the males desire, which is an opportunity to mate. But this isn't always the way it goes. So females are typically the picky ones, but it's actually about availability, reproductive availability. So in seahorses, the situation is the exact opposite, because the males, after the egg is fertilized, will carry the fertilized egg to term. And so the males are taken out of the mating game for long periods of time, instead of the females. And what we find is that females compete for the attention of males among seahorses. So it's a very interesting idea, and certainly there are a lot of traits, like certain color, the reason male songbirds tend to be more colorful than females, or the sort of elaborate sort of rituals that males go through in various species to attract females. It seems to explain some of that, as well as the physical dimorphism, right? The sexual dimorphism that we see. Okay, that does it for today. Next time, we're going to talk a little bit about classification and how to read a cladogram, which is a representation of evolutionary history. Until then, take it easy. I hope you take care and have a great time.